listening to the Good Morning Show.
Good morning. Good morning. If you're joining us just here at the 9 o'clock hour, this is Casey Ferran sitting in for Mr. Oliver Thomas today. I will also be here tomorrow, and we've been having some great conversation today. We just wrapped up a discussion with Mr. Marshall Pierre, a firearms instructor, and he's the owner of Pierre Basic Guns over in Marrero. He's some deep discussion on firearms and self-defense, and also some of the laws regarding gun rights and things like that. So we also want to continue our discussion this morning. We have Dr. Denese Shervington here, a psychiatrist and president and CEO of the Institute of Women in Ethics Studies. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
It's always a pleasure to hear you in your voice. I love your voice. It's so soothing.
I love yours too.
Thank you. I appreciate it. For people who aren't familiar with the Institute of Women in Ethics Studies, Ethnic Studies, IWES.
Yes, IWES.
Talk a little bit about the work you guys do there.
Okay, so we are a national non-profit organization that's domiciled here in New Orleans. We've been here since 1993. We're entering our 25th year of service. And we primarily are a community-based public health organization. Our mission is to improve the quality of life in all spheres, physical, mental, spiritual essence, for women of color and their families, but for all women and ultimately for all people.
Marginalized communities includes women.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is a very deep, can be often a heavy line of work. I mean, what are some of the situations or things that you're most coming into contact with when working with women here in New Orleans?
Well, whenever we say women, we always have to include their families, their children. You know how we are.
Yep.
And so the issues that we face are oftentimes long, intergenerationally based, historical and present day oppression and trauma. And sometimes no matter how successful we think we are materially, we oftentimes struggle with these histories that come, especially for women of color. We carry a lot of the pain that has gotten us to here, the pain of our ancestors, our survival. And so that connected with the struggles that we currently face, oftentimes it gives pause in our lives. And so a lot of the work that we do is around healing. How do we engage with our communities in ways that they can create the appropriate mechanisms for their healing? So whether it's information or different practices, we try to understand what the needs are and how best to support the community.
And when you kind of talked about a little bit just the generational trauma and oppression from years, are we still carrying some of those burdens and harassments and abuse from the years of slavery when women were, as we know, sometimes often raped on their own properties? I mean, does that still live with us?
I think so. I think I am going to take from one of the psychiatrists, psychologists, Jung, who talked about the unconscious collective, that we carry the weight unconsciously of generations past. I remember when I first came to New Orleans many, many years ago, every time I pass Congo Square, I just get this really heavy feeling. I had no idea until someone told me what the history was, but it never felt good. I always felt burdened. And so, yes, we carry that. And we know that oftentimes our survival is based on secrets. You know, we avoid and we keep secrets. But those secrets are just oftentimes on the outside. On the inside, we still feel that pain. So my interest is really in looking at trauma, how trauma turns up in us, and then, of course, how do we heal from that?
And I want to start by talking about kind of the secrets you mentioned. I mean, these are things that are hard to talk about. the abuse by family members sometimes, close friends of family.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that women don't want to tell anyone that's happened to them. How do we start that conversation so they're no longer secrets but are common truths that women are living with?
Mm-hmm. Well, oftentimes the young girl was told, if you talk, I'm going to do something to you. You're going to get hurt. And so she learned very early on that her survival was based on keeping the truth away. Oftentimes, and I've worked over my 30 years of seeing women in therapy, oftentimes they weren't believed.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, oftentimes it was by a parental figure, oftentimes a mother, who, because she didn't want to face her own abuse and trauma, could not tolerate hearing that was also happening in her daughter.
Mm-hmm. And that, I'm sure, invokes a type of rage about what happened to her from her past, and kind of reminds her and makes her relive. Yeah. When you talk about, trauma in women, how does it play out in their behavior? How can you know, or maybe spot signs of trauma in a young girl as they're growing up?
I think a lot of people might be very familiar with what's called ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. This was a study that was done in the late 80s, 90s. That's become really popular now and has been very popularized in certain communities where people are telling you their ACE scores. And what came out of this study was, and this was a study of 17,000 people, that if before the age of 18, a child experienced adversities such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, or grew up in a household where there was a lot of dysfunction, and that dysfunction could be a parent had a mental illness, a parent was substance abusing, and very important in our community, a parent was incarcerated. That when there's a combination of more than 4 of these factors, that as adults, those who've had these experiences are more likely to die earlier, develop substance abuse problems, smoke more in the substances, includes nicotine, cigarettes, and just have a poor quality of life, more suicidality, and just more, one could say overall, displeasure, discontent, and for some people, clinical depression.
Does that play out into aggression? That may,
Yes.
Internalized anger becomes depression and rage. How does that play out with their interaction with people?
Well,
or even in future relationships?
Yeah, one of the phenomenon that we see now as we talk about young girls being pushed out of school, oftentimes there's a history of sexual abuse, and which was unaddressed. There's a kind of direct link for young girls. So oftentimes either the girl blanks out, wherein she's dissociating, she's not paying attention, she's not present, or she can become very aggressive. It can be either or.
How should parents respond if they maybe suspect a child has been abused sexually?
I think the response should be, this is not tolerable, and do something to immediately stop it. This is one of the incidents where, as mental health professionals, if a young person, and this also happens to boys. I know we're focused on girls, but I don't want it to seem that it's only girls that this happens to. We have to make reports. If any young person tells us that they're being abused, we have to break confidentiality and make a report to social services. And really what a child needs, if this is happening, if unfortunately this is happening in the household, really needs to be believed. It's very, in my years, many years of my work, it is very unlikely that a young person is going to make this story up. And if indeed, say, she is making this story up, then it's why would she do this? What's going on? So there might be something else, and maybe it's seen. But for the most part, as parents, we should believe our children. And it's really not, oftentimes it's not what happened, but what the response was. So if a bad event happened to a child, but they feel they've been supported, they've been loved, and they're being protected, that is, we won't make this happen again, it's much easier for a child to heal from this than if the parent says, well, I don't know, I don't, prove it to me. Well, how does a child do this?
Right. And if you're just tuning in, we're talking to Dr. Denese Shervington, a psychiatrist. She's also the president and CEO of Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies, a national organization based right here in New Orleans. In dealing with childhood trauma and having a parent help to respond to a child's issues, is it best to immediately start some type of therapy once you are made aware of this type of situation?
Yeah, absolutely. When in a child, one of the most important things a child needs to be able to accomplish is a sense of trust which starts in the home, in their community, and in the world at large. Just a basic trust that, you know what, I'm going to be okay. I have support. People are looking out for me. When these kind of violations happen, we break that sense of trust and safety in a young person. And therapy is a place where you can help someone to understand and put in the proper place what happened in the past, recognize that this is the past, and that really the present and the future is wide open. Their choices.
And when a child becomes an adult, how does this play out? Like I kind of was mentioning this earlier, just into their adult relationships. When a woman is abused as a child and starts to involve themselves romantically with a man or woman in later relationships, how does that interaction kind of play out? Does that abuse show up in their interaction with that partner?
It tends to, if it's not resolved. So if she's not done the work to understand and put this bad thing in its place, then she might find herself what we call in traditional psychotherapy repetition compulsion. So she's kind of repeating the experiences that happened in an attempt to master it. So she might be choosing partners that somehow psychologically resemble the abuser. Like we oftentimes say, why does the woman keep going back? It's because she has not yet fully resolved what went wrong, and she might be trying to, her attempt, as maladaptive as it is, but it is some degree of her trying to regulate herself and gain some agency, trying to see if she can have some control, some mastery over what happened. It's dysfunctional, and these are things one can work out in therapy to understand, oh, so this is why I'm doing this. So the next time when that person turns up, she might have 10 seconds to say, do I really want to do this? Do I need to repeat this?
Because you're understanding why the action is happening.
Yeah.
And if you are tuning in, we do invite you to call in. You can call in on the talk line at 504-260-9265. We're here talking to Dr. Denese Shervington of the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies. And then there's another component you touched on, too, is substance abuse, and how that is kind of a way to self-medicate or mask the feelings that you have from past abuse. How prevalent is that among women who've been abused or suffered trauma in young ages?
Yeah, it can be quite prevalent when we look at the statistics in women who are substance abusing. A significant amount of these women had interpersonal traumas, oftentimes going back to early attachment issues with their mothers. It's women in substance abuse are 2 to 3 times more likely in substance abuse treatment services. Let me correct that. More likely to have a history of post-traumatic stress disorder And I think that this condition has become kind of popular now, especially in New Orleans, where we had this natural disaster. And what happens for some people, they develop post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, meaning that they, months after they've had the bad experience, they continue to relive it, they try to avoid any memories attached to places where the things might have happened, or they can become very hyper-aroused. And oftentimes PTSD, people don't know they have PTSD, but they know there's something wrong. And part of the treatment of PTSD is recognizing something bad happened to you. Something happened that was not good. It's not your fault. Mm-hmm. And we can work this out. We can put this in its place.
And we are going to take a short break in a second, but when we come back, I do want to kind of talk to you about how victims sometimes are blamed for the abuse that happens to them, and why society continues to perpetuate the victimization of the victim after some type of abuse or trauma happens to them. So we'll talk about that when we come back from the break. Okay. We're again here with Dr. Denese Shervington of the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back right after the next break.
WBOK, real talk for real times. You're listening to The Good Morning Show.
And good morning. You are listening to The Good Morning Show. I'm Casey Ferrand here, filling in for our good friend, Mr. Oliver Thomas. He allowed me to sit in his seat today. I'm so gracious for him. And I will actually be back tomorrow, too, if you would like to tune in again tomorrow. And right now, I am joined by Dr. Denese Shervington. She is a psychiatrist, as well as the president and CEO of the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies. You have a lot of stuff under your umbrella. And we have been kind of chit-chatting about some heavy stuff. I won't even want to say chit-chatting, because that's not even this is a serious topic. We've been talking about women and substance abuse concerns, dealing with trauma and abuse, and how that kind of plays out in their lives overall. I want to lighten things up a little bit before we get back into this topic. And you were telling me you are originally from Jamaica.
Yes, I am. Talk
about kind of the difference in life in Jamaica and New Orleans. Is there a commonality, or is it similar or different? How would you say?
I think it's there is a commonality, and I think it went back to the days of slavery. Apparently, the people who got dropped off in Jamaica were the most rambunctious of the slaves that they couldn't control. And I have a feeling that the next stop was Louisiana. One interesting thing I find that when family from Jamaica comes to visit me here, this is the one, if they would never live in the United States, and obviously they're not, they're visiting, this is the one city they say, I would live here. It's very similar. There's a kind of slower pace. Mm-hmm. Life will take care of it. The food's very similar. Mm-hmm. And what people might not know about New Orleans music is that was the music Jamaicans were listening to with the advent of reggae. So the beats are very similar. Mm-hmm. And this is actually one of the first cities that I experienced that the local people, the black people, were really into reggae. In other places I lived, it was not necessarily people of color you would see at the reggae shows. Uh-huh. New Orleans, I was working at good old Charity Hospital, and I'd go to a reggae show, and someone who works on the ward is there, and it just made my heart sing. I feel very, very comfortable living here. It feels very much like home, except there are no beautiful beaches.
Mm-hmm. And you were saying you actually have a pre-Katrina experience and a post-Katrina experience. You lived here prior to, for 14 years.
Yeah, this is where my children went to school. This is where they were raised. My husband and I came here. He first came here to be at LSU, and I joined him.
Mm-hmm.
And then before Katrina, right before Katrina, I had left. I'd gone to New York, because New York is really my home away from Jamaica, like every good immigrant. I started in New York, and I love New York, still love New York, and had gone back to be there. And then Katrina happened, and I felt myself being drawn back. Prior to leaving, I had been the medical director for the Office of Mental Health. And I just had this sense that after Katrina, we were not going to pay attention to the mental health needs, in particular in our community, that was not going to be something that was addressed. And sure enough, children were not being attended to, their families weren't being attended to. So we started at the Institute, I started a division of post-disaster emotional resiliency to try to pay attention to what happens to people when they've been through such a trauma, an extreme trauma. We lost 80% of the city. And what tends to happen is then, as adults, we are struggling to pull our lives back together, and we forget about the children. We forget that they too are struggling. So a lot of the work that we started to do at the Institute was to try to begin to recognize that young people themselves were suffering from stress-related conditions, which I think is directly related to what we've seen, a kind of upsurge in violence among young people. And so we started getting data to show that, yes, indeed, young people are suffering and struggling with post-trauma stress-related conditions, and we began to do as much as we could do. I'm not able to be a clinician to all the thousands of children who are struggling, still struggling in New Orleans. But what we could do is try to work with the schools to at least identify these kids are showing signs of PTSD or depression, or they're being exposed to so much violence, it's hurting them, they're worried. And then we could try to see, can we find some psychological support? We also have been engaging in what we call a public will campaign. The hashtag is SAD, not bad, saying that usually when children are, and I'll put in quotes, acting out behaviorally, that's because there's some emotional turmoil. They're not bad. They need psychological safety. They need to have mental health services. And what's interesting is that some schools, not the public schools our children are attending to, but some of the other schools, the private schools, they paid attention and they provided that kind of psychological safety. And so we have been campaigning for, let's have this for all children in New Orleans.
And I know I remember we discussed this some years ago when you were doing the study with the SAD Not Bad initiative. You started to share some of the stories of individual students that were being brought to you. And we talked about kind of how, and you mentioned this too just now, the way that's played out since Hurricane Katrina, and how some of the people who are committing crimes from Katrina 12 years ago when they were 3 or 4 and going through that trauma, and now at the age of 14, 15, 16, as you said, quote unquote, acting out, that's a trauma that still has not necessarily been addressed, do you think?
Yeah, I have direct experiences teaching a class in one of the schools, and just could not get control of the class. Everybody was just off the chains. They're not able to focus, not concentrate. And at some point I said, okay, I have to stop being a teacher in this class. I'm going to put on my psychiatrist hat. Created a circle and said to the kids, tell me about Katrina. Of course, it took them a minute. They rolled their eyes. Nobody wanted to talk. And once the first person started talking, the stories they told me still live with me. Being on top of buildings for days, not having food or water rising up, and you can't swim. And these kids, I remember at the time they were about 4 or 5. And for some of them, they barely had the memory. Because, it's not until you're after around 5 years that you can have explicit memory and tell a story about what happened to you. And after that experience, there was so much more calm in this classroom. And, the more we give young people the space to talk about what's hurting, what's happening inside, the more they're able to emotionally regulate, and the less we're going to see the kind of behaviors that get them in trouble.
Mm-hmm. And if they're not talking about it, that stuff is boiling inside of them, wanting to come out. Okay, so they will if you allow them.
If you allow them.
Yeah, or ask them the question.
If you ask them what happened, rather than what's wrong with you, say, well, what's happening? And I feel that if we could take this attitude of caring and compassion, we could see things change in our city with our children.
Mm-hmm. And we do have a caller, Ms. Cheryl, calling in. What is your question?
Hello, how you doing?
Good morning.
You guys tapped on a lot of things from Katrina up until the mental illness for the kids and stuff. You got parents that's dealing with the trauma of Katrina, and they get mental health also, but the children can't deal with the parents, so now the children are off on their own with 2 kids, with one in remission of cancer, and then you got another one now. She's she decided she doesn't want to be a girl anymore. She wants to be a guy. So you got these young folks that's now adults after Katrina, and the parents that's not able to deal with them, and grandparents that's getting older and they can't deal with it also, because you got a housing problem. Like you said, you get them out of their communities where they got to go further away to get to the medical care that they need to take care of their children and stuff. And then you got the parents that's trying to survive, and some of them are homeless and stuff, and you got them staying with other family members and friends and stuff. So we are all over the place. So there's a lot of issues in New Orleans, and they got kids that's got veterans for parents, and they can't get the disability benefits that they're supposed to, because now they're adults and they didn't know about it. So there's a lot of issues in New Orleans about everything. So I'm going to be listening to you guys.
All right. Thanks so much for calling in, Cheryl.
All right. Bye-bye.
And, she touched on a lot of different things, but when you have a parent who's also dealt with trauma and a child who's going through trauma, how can a parent attend to a child with trauma when they are also dealing with some of those same issues?
And the adult has to be the adult and recognize that they're struggling and get the kind of help that they need. Sometimes if the parents straighten up, the kids will be okay. A lot of what we see in children, they're reacting to what's happening around them because they're very dependent on adults. Until the age of maybe 5 or 6, a child could barely exist on its own. And very early on, this child recognizes, I am very dependent on this person to change my diapers, to bring me something to eat, to hold me, to make me feel better. And so a lot of early childhood is in bas relief, reacting to the kind of environment in which you're being raised.
So creating a less stressful environment for a child, or finding ways of helping them cope without putting your stress on them is very important. Extremely
important. Oftentimes when I'm seeing children in therapy, deep inside I know I really need to be seeing the parents. The child is just, the symptomatology in the child is really a reflection of, most times, now we know there might be some genetically caused situations, but for the most part, children are reacting to their environment.
Mirroring the behavior of their parents that's, explained or represented for them at home. And then in the schools, you talked about your experience being in a classroom with students, and how do you think schools are being equipped to help and step in some of these situations? Because if a child is dealing with trauma at home and it's going unaddressed with by their parents, should the school somehow step in, or how can they without being asked?
Exactly. And I must say, we work with a lot of schools because we do positive youth development, sexual health, and emotional resiliency work. My organization does in many schools here. And I find school personnel, they're concerned. They want to do something, but they're not equipped. They don't have enough mental health supports in their schools, and they're being tasked with instructions. So teachers, bless their hearts, for the most part, really want to do the right thing, but they also have to get the grades right. And so I think this is really a societal issue. We have to decide, we have to have the will to say that young people, if they're struggling, deserve to have access to mental health supports. And it's best to have that at the school. We don't want the parents that we have to be running all over town to get the kind of support.
The resources.
Yes.
And just for people who are tuning in now, we're here talking to Dr. Denese Shervington with the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies. Do you want to go ahead and give people your information if they want to reach out to you for assistance or other types of access to resources?
Yeah, we can try to help people if they want to have some understanding of what perhaps the move they might need to how we might help connect them to services. As you said, the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies. Our website is www.iwesnola.org. That's iwesnola.org. And our phone number is 504-599-7712. Now, sometimes people will think that if they have a problem as a psychiatrist, I will be able to see them in therapy. Oftentimes, because I'm doing all this other community work, I don't have the time, but we certainly to see everyone individually. But myself and my staff will try as best we can to connect people to the services that are in the city.
Do you think there is enough access to services in our city for therapists?
No, and not enough access to high quality services. As I say, a community like ours that has such high needs deserve the best of the best, the most experienced therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. And unfortunately, that's not always what we get. It saddens me when I go to a school and they'll say, there's some of these rehabs we don't send the children to. They're the ones that are okay and the ones that are terrible. It's very hard to say there are services for children and their family in the city, psychological services, mental health services that are excellent. I will give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Rochelle Head-Dunham at Metropolitan, who is trying so hard to improve the quality of services, public mental health services. It takes time to create quality, but I think that we should feel really good to know that she's trying so hard to have the best of the best of services.
And we had her on a couple weeks ago, last time I was here, and we talked heavily about substance abuse and how that plays into mental health issues or behavioral health issues. And I want to kind of talk to you a little bit. We were just joking earlier during the break about all these videos you see on Facebook and things these days of young girls engaged in like really harsh fights and brutal arguments, and they're being posted online and posted to things like World Star Hip Hop, things like that. But are we seeing a lot more aggressive behavior in young women? And if so, why?
I think what we're seeing is a lack of soothing attention in the way we're raising our children. So I don't think we're teaching our children how to be loving and how to communicate. For example, again, I always go back to my experience in the schools. I would be in a classroom or around the kids, and they're saying the meanest thing. And I would say, why are you saying that? Oh, that's my dog. I say, well, if that's your person, whatever the term is, the most current person, is that how you tell them that you care about them? And they kind of go, oh. So I think what we're seeing reflected is, as adults, we are not teaching our young people how to be loving, how to communicate, how to really begin to develop intimate spaces that are safe and trusting. So they're just mimicking what they see.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way I think we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So when we get asked to see kids because they're fast and they're acting out, what we're seeing are kids who have conflicts and struggles and they don't know how to express them.
So they're not being hugged at home
No.
or told I love you or
No.
express those things at home.
No, they're not seeing love.
Not seeing love. How do you show love to children who aren't seeing love?
You hold them, you look in their eyes, you tell them how wonderful they are, how special they are, that they can be whomever they want to be, that you will help them to get there. When they get on your nerves, as they will, you don't immediately start screaming and yelling. You take a minute, you collect yourself, and you realize a child is just trying to explore their world and figure out what the boundaries are. And you take that moment to redirect, and you also reassure the child that even when those behaviors are being displayed, fundamentally you love and support them and you care for them.
Mm-hmm.
We're not doing that. We're yelling at our kids. We're screaming at them. We're distracted. We're on our phones. I see so many parents now
Not paying attention
to their children.
And speaking of paying attention, I know we were talking earlier just about the national climate of sexual harassment in the workplace and now how people are paying attention because of this Me Too movement. I know some people kind of argue that now it's being brought to the spotlight because we see Hollywood or white actresses or the white women kind of taking the lead on this charge, whereas black women have been victims of abuse in the same way in their homes for years, or even in the workplace. Why do you think now the national attention has been kind of shown and shined on this issue?
I think for exactly the reason you said, that people of power in our society, they can get attention. When Anita Hill testified about what happened, and I'm going to hold the black community responsible.
Oh, yeah.
I
just watched this documentary a few weeks ago.
We didn't support her.
Anita Hill, yeah.
We thought she was airing our dirty laundry. Well, look who we now have in the Supreme Court. So I'm going to hold us responsible. Sometimes we make decisions that are not the best for us.
It's like we don't want our truths to be told publicly.
Yes. And I remember during the midst of this, at the time, I was very, very active with the black physicians and in charge of the women physician component. And we brought her to our convention and honored her. And she was so humble and she was so grateful. I remember we picked her up in a limousine and she said, "You didn't need to do this." And it was like, yes, even though we have let you down, some of us are going to show you that we support you. And now see what has happened. I also think about that woman. Some of us are old enough to remember she was an African woman who was a worker in a hotel. I guess we would call her the maid. And she was sexually abused by a very powerful white male with the World Bank. And we didn't support her. So I think this movement should really give us some time to think about the ways in which we have had those experiences. We haven't supported each other. And maybe to think about how this went all the way back to slavery. That talk about workplace harassment. He could do whatever he wanted to do.
Free reign.
Yeah, he could do whatever he wanted to do.
Yeah, and I kind of teased this earlier before we went to break, talking about re-victimizing the victims and blaming them for the abuse or the assault that happens to them. Talk about that aspect of how that has kind of kept women from coming forward and even wanting to acknowledge the harassment or things that have been done to them.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to the gender inequity. So much rests in, at a societal level, us not respecting the equity and the equality of male and female. Maybe I might have gotten the gender pronouns wrong on that, so I know when I get back to work, if they're listening, they're going to correct me. But whatever, however the binary in genders are, those who are not considered male tend to be of lesser status in our society. And so it's almost as if we expect that women should tolerate the abuses that come our way, either because we deserved it. If we think about one of our biblical stories, we're blamed for being the source of the problems in the world, so we need to reflect on that and say, is that really true? Are we really all Eve? So even starting there, where we're being held responsible, or we have to cover ourselves because men might not be able to control their attractions to us.
Mm-hmm.
So so
you have to not wear the tight clothes or wear the revealing dresses.
Yeah, or you have to cover your face or your head.
Mm-hmm.
I just got back from the Middle East, and so the issues that happen, female genital mutilation, where oftentimes women are involved in the procedure themselves. We have to think about, what are we doing in our oppression? At what point do we recognize that some of these behaviors are behaviors of the oppressed,
mm-hmm.
and that we want to change that?
Yeah, and we're going to wrap things up here for the morning, but I just want to ask you one last question. You're dealing with a lot of heavy stuff. We have had a deep conversation about things. What do you do to self-regulate and, let go of some of the things you have to deal with?
Well, every morning, when I can, I'm in the park.
In the park.
Nature is very healing. Yeah. The ducks have a lot to teach us about freedom, and the swans.
Mm-hmm.
And try to meditate and take care of my body and my mind. And then when I need to, I go to Jamaica and go to the beach.
Take me next time.
All right.
Let's go.
There we go.
Let's plan a work trip.
There we go. I like it.
All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Shervington. It's good to see you again.
It's
pleasure
great
talking
to see you, and thanks for the courage to ask the questions. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us, all of our listeners. We will wrap things up here, but tomorrow, join us back here for the Good Morning Show starting at 7 a.m. I'll be right back in this seat, filling in for Mr. Oliver Thomas. So we'll talk to you all tomorrow. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day.